talk about the possibility of recession and some of the economic headwinds that are facing us. And as typical for the May-June quarter forecast every year, we take our first look at 2024. So in 2022, North Carolina GDP had kind of a rocky road, as you can see. The U.S. economy declined in both the first and second quarters of 22. As you see, North Carolina did fairly well in the first quarter. We had a decline, just a minor decline in the second quarter, but we finished the year fairly strong with essentially 3.5 to 2.7 to 3.7 annualized GDP growth. Overall for the year was 3.8%. Now, well, overall the economy did fairly well. As you can see here from our sector chart, we had some problems here. So let me kind of walk you through this chart for those that are looking at it for the first time. So on the horizontal axis here, watch my cursor, this is the growth for each of these sectors, North Carolina economic sectors. And as you can see, what we had was about half the sectors experiencing growth, but we had a number of sectors, 5 exactly, that actually experienced declines during 2022. And, you know, that's kind of the usual suspects are there: construction, durable goods manufacturing, non-durable goods manufacturing, and also finance, insurance, and real estate all had a slight decline in 2022. Although overall we had 3.8% increase in state GDP during the year. As far as employment growth is concerned, I mean, as you can see, we had a phenomenal year with 163,600 net jobs from December of 21 to December of 22. That's just a phenomenal number. And, you know, normally we see 100,000 job growth in a year, and that's pretty good, but we had a really significant job growth. And even though we had 5 sectors that experienced declines in output, we only had 2 sectors that experienced declines in jobs. And we'll get into this important point later on in the presentation when we talk about kind of some of the strange things that are happening during this cycle. All right, so everybody's talking about inflation. If you turn on the cable news, cable business news networks, I don't care which one you turn on, they're talking about inflation, and they have been for the last year and a half. So let's take a look at this. This is kind of our history of inflation from 2020 through 2023. You can see that before 2021, things were fairly good shape, below 2%. And then in 2021, it started to take off. And we saw that by the summer of 22, we reached that 9.1, which is the high point for the increase in consumer price index. The most recent number, which was for April, turned out to be 4.9%. So it was the first time we dropped below 5% since back in basically April of 21. So it's been a while that we dropped down here, and it's sort of getting inflation under control. Just as kind of a perspective of how inflation measured by the CPI and the Fed funds rate, which is the interest rate that the Feds can manipulate to try to control inflation, you can see that through most of the decade of the 70s, we experienced inflation well above 5%, sometimes in the double-digit range, like mid-70s, 73, again in 75, and again at the very end of the decade, 79 and 80. And so we see that, you know, we got up to 14%, 14 and change. If you look at this, you can kind of trace the two together, and they kind of are a parallel, and it's really the federal funds rate, the interest rate that the Fed is instituting, is kind of chasing inflation. And it isn't until the end of the decade where the federal funds rate gets out above the consumer price index, and we can start to see the CPI come down and generally go down by the early 1980s. And it stayed that way until just a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, when it took off again above that 1% to 2% range that the Fed is trying to target. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. So when we look at what's happened with the Fed over the past roughly year, that for the first 7, 8, 9 months of inflation, they were telling us it was transitory. They were wrong. They admit they were wrong. And now what we have is a situation where they started a little over a year ago in March of 2022 with the first interest rate hike in quite some time. You can see that through the middle of the year, they really pushed it with 75 basis point increases. And now for the last three meetings, they've instituted 25 basis points in each of those last three meetings. Of course, the question becomes, what are they going to do in a few weeks in June? But here's what's interesting. Here we have this blue line is essentially a line of the bar chart I showed you earlier, where we peaked up at 9.1% here in the summer of 22. And it's been coming down ever since. The red line is something that I think is important. That's what we call the CPI core. That's the CPI less food and energy. All right. And here's what's interesting. The overall CPI has been coming down since the Fed has been raising interest rates. It's been coming down. But the core rate has remained fairly stable at around 5 to 6% for well over a year now. And so while the overall rate is coming down, i.e., weighted by food and energy, the core rate, everything else, has been fairly stable. And of course, what we're hoping for here is that when the next information comes out in June, we're going to get that classic Ghostbusters moment when the streams cross and the actual interest rate gets above at least the overall CPI and hopefully the core. That's a bad thing in ghost busting, but it's actually a fairly good thing if you're trying to control it for inflation. So we'll see what happens in June when the Fed Open Market Committee meets again, and whether or not we finally get a Fed funds rate that's above the CPI, both the overall CPI and the CPI core, and at which point we'll now start to have real interest rates. Okay, but on the one hand, though, we're still got a long way to go. The consumer price index since January of 21 has increased by 16% over that period of time. So in April of 23, consumer prices were 16% higher than they were overall in January of 21. And it's just a little over 2 years. However, wages only went up by 11.5%. You do the math, the average consumer is 4.5% behind in their purchasing power compared to January of 21. All right, so we've got a bunch of inflation pressures. This is what kind of got things going on the demand pull side. Domestic spending, very much out of control. We'll talk a little bit more about that later when we talk about the recession. Stimulus checks, enhanced unemployment payments. We had payroll protection, child care credit, and new programs in child care credit that have come subsequent to the COVID stimulus package, and we've had an executive change in the SNAP benefit upgrade, more calories and therefore higher payments to achieve that calorie level. So those are all been demand pull things that basically started this round of inflation. But we've also had some cost push stuff that's kept it going now that a lot of those demand pull issues are no longer with us. So we've had declining labor force participation rates, as we all know, because of shifting demographics. The supply chains have been problematic as China goes through. We rely tremendously on China for a lot of our intermediate good production, and they've been going through waves of COVID and lockdowns. There's some indication they maybe go through another period of that. We'll see what's going on. We've had expanded regulations under the Biden administration, which have made it difficult for some companies to produce at levels that need to be produced at to support the supply chain that they're in. And then finally, energy prices have been all over the place for the last couple of years, and that has not helped. Right now, they're fine, but at any minute, they could go up again. Predicting energy prices is a very, very hard business. All right, and we also have this third thing that's been increasingly becoming a problem, and that's inflationary expectations. And that's where people, businesses, consumers, investors expect prices to rise in the future. And this matters because actual inflation depends on part of what we expect it to be and how we behave in the presence of inflation. And as a result of having gone through now roughly 2 years of rising prices, we don't get upset over it anymore. We just say, oh, that went up. And we don't respond with the appropriate behavior, which is to not buy something. That becomes the inflationary expectation problem. In addition to that, what we've been seeing is while the Fed has been working very, very hard to raise interest rates, again, they made a mistake. They admitted they made a mistake, but they've been fighting very, very hard over the last year and change. However, what we see is that we have a lot of folks, a lot of different parts of the economy that are fighting the Fed. Consumers are fighting the Fed. We'll show you some stuff in just a minute. The stock market's fighting the Fed, until today anyway. The labor market is fighting the Fed. Congress and the president are fighting the Fed. And the Fed, in a sense, is also fighting the Fed when they instituted potential quantitative easing a couple of weeks ago, when they started to see a banking crisis potentially coming to light. And they reversed their trend of quantitative tightening their balance sheet and made funds available for the banking sector. So that's another round of potential quantitative easing taking place. So all of these things are essentially making the Fed's fight using just interest rates much, much harder to accomplish. So we've seen consumer savings when we look at household. I mean, we've been bleeding savings since COVID. And now we're down well below where we were before we went into this thing. Consumers are still spending money, and they're just saving to spend that money. They're bleeding their savings down in order to continue to experience events and kind of get over COVID. We see the stock market dipped during COVID, came back, and it's been bouncing along. It's sideways for sure. There's no question about that. But it is not heating. Normally, you would see the market go down when interest rates are rising. We're not seeing this, partly because I think the market doesn't believe the Fed has the resolve to keep it high enough. But we'll see how that plays out. But the stock market is seriously fighting the Fed as we go forward. We're also seeing the labor market fight. We've seen the number of job openings past 10 million, and until just recently, it stayed above 10 million. That's, from a historic standpoint, that's a good 30% higher than what we typically have, as you can see, going in here at a little over 6,000 to 7,000 job openings at any one time going into the COVID dip. So the job market is still very, very tight. And finally, budget deficit. As you can see, the projection is maybe of 1.4 trillion this year. I think that's low. I think that we'll probably wind up at 1.6 or 7 trillion this year. But you can see what the CBO projection is over the next 10 years in terms of the budget deficit. And that's right, folks. By 2033, 10 years from now, we're projected to be running a $3 trillion deficit. All right. And then the Fed balance sheet, as we saw, they were doing some tapering. And then the banking crisis came along, and they've reinstated quantitative easing. Their balance sheet is going back up again. And in essence, they're fighting themselves in that regard. So we got a lot of folks there that are pushing back very, very hard on the Fed's action to try to raise interest rates and try to slow the economy. We'll see what happens in June. All right, so what do we see in the North Carolina economy for 2023 with all this going on? This is an interesting slide here because what do we see in the third quarter? A slight dip. Real slow in the first and second quarters. Not surprised there. Overall, only 1.4% for the year. Interest rates and slowing the economy is going to have an impact. Whether we call this a recession or not is unclear to me at this time. If you remember, we had the 2 quarters of decline, quarter one, quarter two of 2023, and that was not called a recession. So it's not clear that we're going to have a recession, but I really do think in the second half of the year, the economy is going to slow. North Carolina economy is going to slow as well, maybe not as much as the U.S., but still it's going to slow. And so it's likely that we'll have a negative quarter for the third or the fourth quarter going forward. When we look at the individual sectors, again, it's a mix, and we've got 2 sectors that are showing significant declines. Construction shouldn't be any surprise as interest rates rise, housing starts slow. We're looking at potential commercial real estate problems in 2023, at least in the second half of the year. So all of those things are leading to slowing in construction, and obviously non-durable goods manufacturing is, is also down. And finance, insurance, and real estate is essentially flat for the year, but most other sectors are going to do fairly well. In terms of employment growth, everybody's going to, and this is really sort of an interesting situation here. The next slide will amplify that. 78,000 jobs, less than half of what we had in 2022. Okay. but still a fairly good job year. And every single sector is experiencing job growth. So let's take a look at what we expect to see for the unemployment rate. So this is a historic unemployment rate, and the green line is the North Carolina seasonally adjusted. It was below the U.S. got a little bit above it, and now it's come down to basically just a little bit above the federal rate. Okay, so we're in now just slightly below 3.8%, 3.7%. What's going to happen going forward is kind of interesting. We expect the economy to slow, and we're going to see the unemployment rate rise just a little bit, but only to 3.9%, despite having very, very slow growth in the first 2 quarters of this year and negative growth in the third quarter. And you're going to ask me a question. I said, that seems to be inconsistent. I'm going to tell you a little story here to help you understand what we think is taking place right now. So for those of you that are old enough to remember the 2001 recession, when we started to come out of that in 2002 and 2003, we started to experience what we called at the time a jobless recovery. That happened again in 2010 and 11, coming out of the 2008-9 recession. We had sort of a jobless recovery. But what I'm looking at here is kind of the corollary to that, again, partly because of demographics. But we're going to be looking at a job-full recession potentially. And what do I mean by that? Yeah, we'll have a recession. GDP may fall. Some other indicators maybe fall or be negative. But we're not going to see a real impact on the labor market. Job growth will slow. We'll see slower numbers in job growth. We won't see 2 to 3 million jobs created a year, maybe only 1 million jobs created. And we'll just see a modest uptick in the unemployment rate. We're not going to see 10%. You know, on this graph, I don't even have anything above 5% here, because I just don't see the need to have a number on the axis above 5% for the foreseeable future because of significant changes in the way the labor market is working because of demographic changes that we've talked about in previous forecast presentations. So just keep that in mind. We'll probably have a recession this year, 50-50, maybe 60-40 that we'll have a recession. And it'll be a mild one. And the real key is that it will have very little impact on the labor market. All right, so let's take a look at recession. So my favorite chart here is from the NBE, our National Bureau of Economic Research, which are the keepers of the business cycle. And you can see that prior to the last century, expansions, and I should say that peak to trough, contractions and expansions were about 2 years long each. So you have 2 years of good economic times, and then 2 years of recession, 2 years of expansion, 2 years of recession. In the early part of the 20th century, things got a little bit better, but they weren't a lot better. Recessions lasted a little less time, and expansions were about the same length of time. Since 1940, through the end of the 20th century, recessions really reduced in size, 10 months typical for the length of recession, and over 4 years for an expansion. But in the 21st century, again, 9-10 months for a length of a recession. But look at this, 7, 8, 9 year expansions were typical. Okay, so we've done a lot better job at managing the economy, and I think that we'll do a fairly good job of managing this decline in 2023. And while, you know, there's an outside chance we'll have a little bit rockier landing than we would like, we're all rooting for a soft landing, but I don't think we're going to have more than one or two bounces on the landing at the worst. Okay, so you remember back in 2022 in the first quarter, we had 2 quarters of decline in real GDP, and everybody thought we were in a recession. The NBER said, well, this is what the NBER looks at to determine whether it's a kind of a broad look at the economy. These are the 8 issues that they look at. And what I've done here is give you a little arrow as to where they are right now. So both total non-farm employment and the employment level are still rising. Industrial production is still up. Real manufacturing and trade industry sales have fallen in the last 2 months, so they're down a little bit, but real personal income is up. Personal consumption expenditures are down. Real GDP is up, but real gross domestic income the last quarter has been down just slightly. So what we have here is 5 of the indicators up, 3 of them down. You got to have a lot more than that for the NBER to say that there's a recession. Again, I don't think that these two things are really going to get in a situation where they'll be in a recessionary environment, but maybe the rest of these other six will in fact slow down enough that the NBER might consider that the second half of this year we slide into a recession. All right, so where's the Fed on interest rate policy? This is from Jerome Powell's introduction in the last press conference, May 3rd of 2023. And what he said is, we are seeing effects of our policy. However, the full effects of monetary restraint are to be realized, especially, it will take time, I should say, for the full effects to take place. So he's implying that we're in a slight headwind here going forward, but he says the economy is likely to face further headwinds from tighter credit conditions. And that's speaking to what he sees in terms of credit conditions as a result of the bank failures that took place a month or so ago. And in that conference, there was a strong indication that they may pause in their June meeting. Subsequent to that, and it's just more of that, subsequent to that, there has been a little bit of loosening in terms of the hawks getting a little bit firmer footing. And so what we think is that the June rate is probably going to be another 25 basis points. And maybe the July they pause, but right now, the June, I would say it's 60-40, no worse than 50-50 that we see another 25 basis points increase in the federal funds rate, which you put the two things together with maybe inflation coming down, we start to see those lines cross, and maybe we start to see real interest rates this summer. And, you know, if that happens, then I think the Fed will be comfortable in pausing in July going forward. Okay, so we got these economic headwinds that we've talked about. You know, what's going on? Why do we think there's going to be a recession in 2023? These are the things that are really at the forefront: consumer confidence, energy prices, what the Fed's going to do, inflation, the problem that we see with wage catch-up. You know, we got a tight labor market, and we know that employees are 4.5% less wealthy, if you will, or have less income than they did, or less buying power, I should say, than they did before this all began. We still have continuing supply chain issues, and we still have deficit spending going forward. So let's take a look at this. Well, consumer confidence, this is the Michigan Sentiment Survey. It's not as low as it was back in 2008 and 2009 when the economy basically fell through. But, it's lower than it was at the bottom, if you will, of COVID and during that whole year of COVID. So we've had this significant drop earlier in this year. We're back up to 63.5, but that's still way lower than what we'd like to see, somewhere between 80 and 90, 80 and 100, which we had experienced through most of the second half of the decade before COVID. Okay, so consumers are it won't take much to set them off and sit on their hands going forward. Oil prices, on the other hand, have come down from their peak of last summer. And it's likely that we will not see $4 a gallon gasoline this summer. As a result of that, we're sitting most recently with $75, $76 oil prices per barrel. So that's not as low as it was back in COVID, but still a number that we can handle. Here's that graph again where the federal funds rate is now starting to get a little bit above where we were. And, I've done something here. I have actually pushed the Fed funds rate up over 5% here, just to, we're looking at 4.9 from the April number, and we may be lower than that in May. You'll start to see the streams cross here with the overall CPI. With the core, I'm not so sure. We'll wait and see what that number is in a couple of weeks. Here's our wage catch up. This is inflationary pressure because with the tight labor market, with a tight labor market, workers are going to be pushing to gain back this purchasing power over the next year. And that's going to make the Fed's job even more difficult and harder to achieve. And then we've got the deficit, and we've got to fight over that going forward. But the CBO, which is pretty nonpartisan in terms of what they do, and pretty reliable in their ability to forecast these things, they're looking at a tremendous increase from where we have been to, COVID level in just 10 years. And that is very, very disconcerting going forward. So what's the economy look like for 2024? Well, if it all works out just right, and we have a soft landing and the Fed can start easing by the very end of 2023 or maybe very early in 24, I think 24 is actually going to turn out to be a fairly good year. A little bit better, stronger growth than in 23, about 1.6%. But as you can see, it's going to pick up by the end of the year. And I think my belief is the Fed will get a handle on this. They are clear in terms of trying to deal with inflation, and they're going to get that down. And if they do, then I think that we'll get back on track for 2 to 2.5% growth going forward from the end of 2024 on. When we look at individual sectors, I think all sectors will do well. I think construction, particularly in the manufacturing sectors, will pick up as interest rates start to fall during 2024. Now, I don't expect them to get back to, basically what they were for the last 5 years prior to COVID, which is, very, very low interest rates and zero since COVID, but, very, very low in the 2% range. But I do expect them to get back in the 3 to 4% range, which I think is an appropriate level in terms of pricing the cost of investment and money going forward. And as far as jobs are concerned, I think we'll see a decent job year in 2024, 53,000 jobs, a little less than than this year, and certainly a lot less than in 2022. But you got to remember, 2022, those job numbers were really still the last part of the catch up from the COVID downturn. So that's really what was going on still in 2020, 2022. So key takeaways going forward. Number one, energy shocks, exogenous energy shocks that come from OPEC or what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. These things are real and they matter and they can change anything almost instantly. So these exogenous shocks, particularly in energy, really can change things. Two, Fed policy matters, and the resolve. I think that they are serious at this point in time. I think they know they missed it 2 years ago, and thinking that for a long period of time through most of 2020 and into early 21, they thought that this was transitory. They know they made a mistake. They admitted they made a mistake, and I don't see them making another mistake. So I think they're going to continue to go forward and work very, very hard on making sure that they get inflation under control. Obviously, by the end of this year, it's not going to be 2%, but hopefully by the end of 24, it'll be close to 2%. I think that's really what we're looking for. We've got to be real conscious of demand side versus supply side inflation. Right now, we've got a little bit of demand side still problematic, but we still have quite a bit of supply side inflation taking place. A stock market correction could change a lot of things as it affects wealth and therefore purchasing power and purchasing behavior. And as I said earlier, I think that there's a 60-40 chance of recession in late 23, third quarter, worst case fourth, or the longest case fourth quarter. But I think third quarter is when we're going to start to see it. And so I think that now whether we'll call it a recession or not, it's unclear, okay? Because remember, we got those 8 things we got to look at. We got to have a preponderance of evidence suggesting it. But we will certainly have a slowdown, and we'll have a negative GDP quarter sometime during this year, probably the third quarter. All right, keys to watch. All right, so Fed tapering, quantitative tightening. Is the Fed going to start to work on that balance sheet again now that I think we're through the worst of the potential banking sector problems that we saw out on the West Coast amongst the regional banks? Second thing, always keep your eye on energy prices. That can change the equation almost instantly. Everything we do depends on energy and the cost of energy. At the end of this month, we get consumer confidence, May 30th. So we get an indicator of what's going on there. June 2nd, we get the monthly job growth of the employment situation. We'll see how many jobs we created in May and what the unemployment rate was in May. The May inflation rate comes up June 13th, the first day of the FOMC meeting. So that'll be the next inflation number we get, and we'll see whether or not those two inflation numbers, the overall CPI and the core CPI, drop below the federal funds rate, and the Fed start to feel good about where they're going. Again, I think that unless there's a miraculous change in inflation, and I don't see that happening, I think the Fed's going to go ahead and do another 25 basis points in their June meeting. And then finally, second quarter GDP comes out on July 27th. That's going to be a real indicator of what's going on. You'll notice that today, this morning, the second read of the first quarter number came out. So the first read of the first quarter 23 US GDP was 1.1% growth. The second read was up to 1.3%. So they revised it upward by 0.2%. And that's a pretty significant. We usually don't see a 0.2% increase in the read from the first in the GDP from the first to second read. That's as more information comes in. So it's suggesting the economy is actually stronger in the first quarter of this year than what we initially thought it was, and that will be factored into the FOMC meeting in June. So that pretty much wraps it up for now. And so we'll have a question and answer period. I don't believe this, Jennifer. I managed to get done exactly on time. So we have plenty of time for questions, and I can see that the chat function is already generating several questions. So yes. Jennifer, we'll take it over. And again, thank you to all for sharing this presentation.
Yeah, indeed. So thank you, John. That's really interesting. And we have received a number of questions so far. As a reminder, you can still submit your questions via the chat feature, and we will try to get to as many as we can between now and 1 o'clock. So let me just start with debt. Okay. It's in the news, right? So
no, Jennifer, I didn't expect that question.
Right. So we've gotten several on this. So what is your take on the current debt ceiling conversation? And then what are the implications should we not increase the debt ceiling?
Okay, so let's start with a couple of facts so that we can start dealing from a factual basis. So in January, we actually hit our debt ceiling, which means we could not borrow any more money above that point, $31.4 trillion. So for the last 4 months, we have been we've been unable to issue new debt. Now we can replace debt, or what we call rollover debt. Debt that comes due can then be replaced up to that cap of $31.4 trillion. However, a couple of things. The government still takes in money. Every day, people send checks to the government. Businesses send checks. And every day, the government writes checks. But, the government is a big agency, big operation, lots of agencies. And they all have their individual accounts. You can think of them as banking accounts or checking accounts, and they all have money in them. And we've been essentially, the Treasury's been giving different agencies IOUs, say, we owe you this much money. Thank you for letting us use your money over the next whatever. This is not debt. These are IOUs. That's different. And I don't want to get into that subtle difference between Treasury debt and IOUs, but it doesn't require Congress permission to issue an IOU to an agency to borrow their funds for a little while. According to Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary, she has told us now for about 3 or 4 weeks that, in her belief, the drop dead date is June 1st. And that is when these extraordinary measures, which is essentially use of IOUs for accounts that have money, will cease to exist. They will have no longer. Now, we can argue whether it's June 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 15th. There's a lot of information out there suggesting it's one or the other, that's too early. I don't think we should really worry about that at this point in time. The real issue is, okay, what happens when we hit that date and it actually, there's no more Peter to help us out? All right. So that's what's interesting, and we've been told that we are going to default when that happens. And I'm going to challenge that, okay? Because if you look up the definition of default, it's failure to meet your debt obligations, which basically means that we've got $31.4 trillion of outstanding debt that every so often we have to make a interest payment on. Currently, that interest is about $600 billion a year, or roughly 10% of our expenditures. All right. So here's what happens. Let's suppose that they don't reach a debt ceiling. Okay. We got close to it in 2011, and we can spend some time on that later if somebody has a question about that. But they didn't actually go over the brink. Little story here. You all have a cousin somewhere, or a nephew somewhere, that makes $100 a week, but has a habit of spending $110 a week $110 every week. And they put that $10 every week on their credit card, and that goes up 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 every week. And then after about 20 weeks, they hit their credit card limit, $200. The credit card, somebody says, sorry, we can't raise your credit limit at this point in time. And so now they're still making $100 a week. But what they can't do is spend 110 now. They got to figure out how to spend 100. So they got to figure out where they're going to cut their expenditures by that $10. Now, they get to make the choice. They can choose to continue to buy the expensive latte at Starbucks or the Mai Tai drink at the local the bar or what have you. Or they can choose not to do that, and they can make their rent payment and their car payment and buy some food at the grocery store. Those are choices. And that's the same situation with the U.S. government. We bring in about 77 cents of every dollar that we spend. That's the difference is what we have to borrow. The 23 cents is what we have to borrow to spend that dollar. We can choose what we spend that 77 cents on. And it would seem to me that some of the things that we would choose, number one, would be to pay the interest on our debt. That's only 10% of that, $1. So I think we can handle paying the interest on that debt. We would probably also be able to handle paying Social Security payments. All right. What we probably won't do is we probably won't make Medicare and Medicaid payments promptly to hospital systems. We probably won't. We'll probably send some federal workers home. We probably can afford to send home the EPA, Health and Human Services, a few other departments. We can send the employees home and not pay them. And the best example of this is, while we haven't reached a debt ceiling crisis and past that, we have shut the government down for lack of budget. And that's exactly what we do. We make choices about what the essential payments are. So the idea that somehow or other we're not going to pay the interest on the debt and we're not going to pay Social Security recipients, I think is just outlandish. And I don't think that that's ever going to happen. And certainly in the history of having, and we've had a dozen government shutdowns in the last 3 or 4 decades for short periods of time, some for as many as almost 3 weeks. But we continue to make those payments on those two issues. So that's my sense of the debt. It's a political thing between the Republicans and the Democrats. And I don't think either one is really telling us the truth as to how exactly this will play out. But I'm not worried about it. And I think that even if we pass that drop deadline, we'll see this play out. It's the same thing we saw play out a few years ago when we shut the government down for a few days.
Okay. So sort of related to that, you mentioned that we're headed in future years to a situation where we are generating $3 trillion. I actually prepared a slide for this question, and no, folks, Jennifer and I did not collude on this question, but I knew this was coming up. All right, so here's a new slide. All right. And the blue line is our revenue since 1990. I know most of you probably don't remember when we had 4 years of government budget surplus, but we actually did. We actually took in more money than we spent in the late 90s and early 2000s until the 2001 recession. However, if you kind of trace the blue line along, there's a trend here that it's pretty stable in terms of the revenues we collect. And then if you look at, in 2002, we had kind of a little bit of an uptick, but it's been fairly constant with the exception of what happened during the Great Recession here. But we got back on that track after the Great Recession. And if you just extend that line along, you can see it's
And then all of a sudden COVID hits and we go out of town. And instead of doing this, we keep going. And you can see the gap that's opened up here. See the gap that's opened up here. And that's really what's so troubling. And the CBO thinks we're going to start to close that gap. But there are a lot of folks out there that are very, very concerned that we aren't. And if we look at the legislation that's passed in the last 2 years, February of 2021, we had another $2 trillion, $1.9 trillion COVID bill. That summer, we had the infrastructure bill, and then we had the CHIPS bill. And despite all the rhetoric to the extent that we had pay-fors in there, we don't have any pay-fors in any of that legislation. And most of that legislation not only increased expenditures in the near term, they have programs in them that are not obvious that will continue on forever. And so this recent change right here in terms of the relationship between our expenditures and the trend that we've been on, revenue and the trend that we've been on in revenue, which is fairly consistent, and the trend we've been on in expenditures, which is fairly consistent. And then all of a sudden there's a sea change as a result of COVID, and it hasn't changed. And again, that is a concerning thing. One other thing I want to mention, Jennifer, is that right now we're spending 10% of our budget on interest to service the debt. By 2023, that'll be 15 to 16% of our budget. So we only get discretion on 85%. 15% we're locked into. That's not really a way to run a business or a country.
All right, you were prepared for that one. So
I have no more slides. I'm going back.
All right. So really related are just to what you just talked about are some questions about interest rates. Do you have a sense of whether the Fed will raise, lower, maintain interest rates as we head into the third and fourth quarter of this year?
Yeah, if you look at the market, okay, and the betting on interest rates that's taking place in the financial markets, they're suggesting that we're going to start to see the Fed scale back in the second half of 23. And they're expecting that by this time next year, they'll be a full point below where they are now. I'm not so sure. And this is just my insight on this, having gone through this before with Paul Volcker and some other Fed chairs. Their legacy, yes, they have a dual mandate that was instituted in 1977, where they're supposed to maintain price stability and full employment. Okay, so there's a dual mandate there. There's no question about that. There has been talk that maybe that dual mandate needs to be relaxed to one mandate, price controls, but inflation, and keeping it, and not worry about, the Fed doesn't need to worry about full employment. That's a fiscal policy, i.e. Congress president issue. I'm not so sure I agree with that position totally, but here's what I do know. Fed chairs get in there and they know their legacy is going to be, how did they do on inflation? And we've got that guy that's sitting up there that's kind of at the top of the mountain. That's Paul Volcker. He took 10 years of double-digit inflation and solved the problem. And so he stands at the top of, he's kind of the head of the Mount Rushmore of Fed chairs. And I think Jerome Powell looks at himself as he has an opportunity here to be that person again. And so I think that right now he has enough support from other FOMC members that he is probably going to pause in July. But depending on what we see going forward, I wouldn't bet on a rate decline or a rate increase. I think there's a 50-50 shot in either one of those in the fall. So I don't see the rate being significantly different at the end of this year than what we have right now.
So let's shift to consumers a little bit. One of the questions in the chat asks is, how would you characterize the state of the consumer in 2024 as juxtaposed against, where we are in 2023?
Well, right now, the consumer is still driving this economy and still essentially contributing substantially to inflation. There's no question about it. And, I'm as guilty as the next person. I went through a year of COVID, and at my age, it's kind of like, I'm not to make sure that if this happens again, I got everything on that bucket taken care of, in that bucket taken care of. And I think that a lot of people are thinking that way, particularly baby boomers. I mean, we forget there are 76 million baby boomers, and half of them are over 65 now. And so, we kind of forget that. So that's, 35 to 40 million baby boomers who have a short lifespan going forward. And they're going to enjoy it. And they're as much as responsible as any other group in terms of pushing on the demand side of the economy. I don't see that changing. I used the term earlier, jobful recession. Companies have had a really difficult time filling job vacancies with qualified people, despite some of the layoffs that have taken place in some of the high-tech industries. It's still relatively easy to get a job in those industries. And I think, we've heard labor hoarding, the term labor hoarding. And I think that a lot of companies are going to be very hesitant to lay folks off until things get really bad. So I think that if you see the economy slow down a little bit, but unless you got a big shock like a banking crisis or, $100 barrel energy, I don't really see companies laying people off in any great numbers. So people are going to continue to have income. And when they have income, given what they experienced 3 years ago, they're going to keep spending money. So I don't see much change in 24, by the way.
Got it. Okay. So speaking of banking crisis, one of the questions that came in is asking about your thoughts on the health of the banking, kind of the financial services sector, period, right now. Given the things that have happened already this year, of course, this is especially important to us here in Charlotte.
Charlotte banks seem to be fine this time around, but again, we've got big banks and those don't seem to be troubles at this point in time. Although one caveat, I always worry, we're seeing some changes in commercial real estate. Don't know what's going to happen with that in the second half, but we could start to see some issues take place. But as far as what has taken place so far this year with essentially 3 bank failures, but companies coming in, other banks coming in to rescue, and the Fed coming in to rescue, I would simply say one thing, and that is that I think that the Congress, once they get this debt ceiling problem straightened out, which they may or may not do sooner rather than later, I think they need to look at this whole concept of deposit insurance. Now, I know that what I'm about to say is going to have probably half of our audience screaming at me about moral hazard, and I appreciate that. But we have to be able to understand that banking is substantially different from any other business that we deal with. And banks cannot have runs. No bank under any circumstances, no matter how well managed or run, how well managed they are, can effectively handle a run on the bank. We saw Republic, I'm pretty sure, see their deposits go from about 130 billion to like 70 billion in a 2 to 3 week period. And they still managed to stay afloat, but that's about all you could do. And the big thing on this that's happening is that many companies that have their transaction account to payroll, to make payroll and to pay their suppliers have more than 250,000. Now, I'm not suggesting that we go to unlimited deposit insurance, but I think that we need to really start to think about either raising substantially or going to unlimited deposit insurance on transaction-only accounts. So those will be accounts that don't pay interest, so they're not an investment. It's working capital, if you will, for businesses. And that will really cut down the run, because if that money the runs are coming from small and medium-sized businesses who can easily have more than 250,000 in their checking account to operate their business. Yeah, can they have transfers and work with transfers from different financial agencies to fill that? Yeah, but it's cumbersome and it's a pain in the neck to do. So I think that if we would just look at deposit insurance on transaction, non-interest bearing accounts only, expanding that, I think we could solve once and for all this banking problem without creating a moral hazard issue.
All right. So banking. I also want to touch on commercial real estate, which you've mentioned lightly already. We have a question, can you touch on some of the challenges that you referenced? And do you consider North Carolina as doing any better than other parts of the country?
Well, let's talk a little bit about what the problem might be with commercial real estate. We've got a lot of cities right now with a lot of, in the background of my slide, a lot of those floors as we speak right now don't have any people on them. And virtually all that space is leased. And somebody holds the mortgage or the lease on that. And when those come due, they're longer term. They're not year to year, they're longer term. When those come due, companies are going to make decisions about whether or not they want that much space in those buildings. So that creates two issues. One, we're going to see a slowdown in commercial real estate anyway. And that's going to be both office space and brick and mortar retail space. We're seeing that now. And that's on the brick and mortar retail side, that's been going on for quite some time. But we're going to see, and I wouldn't be surprised to see malls close when they get to a critical point in terms of they lose an anchor tenant or two and they just cannot survive going forward. So we're going to see that, and we're going to see as these leases come due and have to be renegotiated, we're going to see office space in central cities decline. Some cities more so than others. But that's not going to happen this year all at once. That's going to be kind of a slow bleeding process over the next several years, because these leases are typically long and they all don't come due in 23 or 24. They're going to slowly roll out, but we're going to start to see pressure on the commercial real estate side. Having said that, in Charlotte, we don't really see a lot of our financial institutions aren't as heavily into commercial real estate as in other parts of the country. So I'm not sure we're going to see a big problem on that, but it's for certain something to keep your eye on going forward the second half of this year, but mainly in 2024. I think we're going to see more of that take place.
Okay, so we've got a ton of great questions, but we just have time for one more. This one, I'm going to take us international now. So, is the ongoing war in Ukraine having any impact on the U.S. economy?
A little bit on our budget, because we got to replenish the military supplies that we've been sending to them for the last year or so. And so that puts pressure on our budget and on our budget deficit, which is obviously a thing. But to be honest with you, Jennifer, the embargo is weakening and weakening and weakening as we go forward. I'm not a military expert, so I don't know what's going to play out between the Russians and the Ukrainians in terms of territory. I foresee this thing potentially going on for quite some time. But and this is a sad commentary, and I apologize to anybody I offend in advance, but we have lots of wars going on in this world right now. And this will probably just fall into the category of, here's another one. And as far as international trade is concerned, as far as Russian energy, and they're second only to us in terms of the amount of energy they produce. And they're one of the biggest exporters of energy behind Saudi Arabia. So as far as the impact on the world economy that war is having, it's having less and less and less and less impact as time goes on, because they are skirting, and quite frankly, oil's pretty fungible. So, and that's their main. I mean, I love the analogy that the late Senator John McCain made about the former Soviet Union or Russia. They're a gas station with a country attached to it. It really, that's what it is. They don't really have much of any other economy, so only their energy has an impact on the world economy, and they seem to be able to sell as much as that as they want at whatever price they want to sell it at.
Mm.
We've been unsuccessful at basically enforcing that embargo.
All right, John, that lot packed in. Thank you. And thanks to all of the folks who joined us for the North Carolina Economic Forecast today. So please make plans to join us for the next forecast and the release of the third quarter report on September 7th. That's September 7th, 2023. We'll open up registration this fall. Sponsorships are available year-round for the North Carolina Economic Forecast. And please contact us if you're interested in supporting the research that underlies this presentation and allows us to connect with meaningful information to the business community, our alumni and students. So to help us for planning for future Belk College events and to be entered for a chance to win a Belk College gift pack, please complete the online survey so you can scan the QR code that is on the screen. That concludes today's program, and we look forward to seeing you in September. Thank you.
Recording stopped.